My quiet backyard became ground zero for an epic property battle, and I never saw it coming. This isn't just about a fence line. It's about uncovering a tangled web of bureaucracy, hidden clauses, and how a homeowners association can literally steal your land. You won't believe what I found. You know how some mornings feel ordinary, quiet, predictable, maybe even comforting? That is exactly how that morning began. Coffee in hand, dog leash in the other, I was ready for another calm day in my backyard. The little slice of peace I thought I fully owned. But within a few hours, that calm would shatter, replaced by confusion, paperwork, and the kind of disbelief you only feel when your reality suddenly stops making sense. It started innocently enough. I was thinking about extending my backyard fence. Nothing major, just pushing it a few feet further to even out the line with my neighbor's yard. So I called the local surveyor, the kind of thing responsible homeowners do. He came out the following week, clipboard in hand, and started taking measurements. Everything seemed fine at first, until I noticed his brow furrow, his steps getting slower. Then he looked up and asked, "Did you know your property line stops here?" I followed his finger. It was pointing almost 10 feet short of where my current fence stood, and where beyond that fence sat a small corner of manicured lawn that I had been mowing for years. I laughed at first, assuming it was a mistake. "That can't be right," I told him. "I've got the original plat map and deed in my files." He just nodded slowly and said, "You might want to check those again." That night, I pulled out the manila folder with all my home documents, the same one I hadn't opened since closing day, years ago. I spread everything on the dining table: deed, survey, HOA welcome packet, even the glossy brochure from the developer that had once promised perfect harmony between nature and community. And there it was, buried in the fine print of a legal description that might as well have been written in another language. When I compared it against the surveyor's map, the truth hit me like a punch in the chest. Nearly 15% of my backyard wasn't legally mine. I froze. For years, I had trimmed those hedges, planted flowers along that fence line, even built a small shed, all on land that, according to county records, technically belonged to someone else. How could that be possible? The logical part of me started firing off questions. If it isn't mine, whose is it? Was it sold to the wrong person? Did the HOA make a boundary change I missed? And most importantly, what does this mean for me? I kept staring at that map, the thick black line dividing what I thought was mine and what apparently was not. Each minute that passed, my disbelief deepened. It wasn't just about property. It felt like someone had quietly rewritten the borders of my life without telling me. The next morning, I called the county assessor's office. After waiting on hold for 20 minutes, I finally reached a clerk named Denise. She sounded kind but cautious, the way people do when they have to deliver news they did not create. After checking my parcel number, she said, "Well, according to our records, part of that area was reclassified as a shared easement back in 2009. You should have been notified at closing." 2009. That was 2 owners before me. I could feel my jaw tightening. I was never told anything about an easement. My title company didn't mention it. The HOA didn't mention it. No one did. Denise sighed. "It happens more often than you think. You might want to reach out to your HOA and the original developer. This could be a documentation error." A documentation error. The phrase sounded harmless, but I had already begun to sense that it was the kind of error that could cost someone everything. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in front of my laptop, cross-referencing my documents with public county maps. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. The map showed several properties in my cul-de-sac with oddly shaped boundaries. Little overlaps, small slices missing. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a jigsaw puzzle that someone forced together. And in the middle of that puzzle was my land, or at least the part I thought was mine. It was as if someone had drawn the map with a shaking hand and never bothered to fix it. That was the night the panic set in. Every homeowner knows their property isn't just dirt and grass. It's security, stability, and honestly, pride. You maintain it, pay taxes on it, and assume the lines are clear. But sitting there, staring at those mismatched maps, I realized I didn't even know where my land began or ended anymore. I felt helpless, like the ground under my own feet was no longer solid. And worse, I had no idea who to trust. Was it a government mistake, a developer oversight, or something the HOA had quietly known about and never disclosed? The real turning point came a few days later. I received a follow-up from the surveyor, a detailed report stamped and signed. At the bottom of page 3, under Encroachments Noted, it read, "Portions of Lot 47, client property, overlap with construction belonging to lots 48 through 50. Permanent structures, residential foundations, observed within disputed boundary zone." I reread that line 3 times. Residential foundations. That meant someone's actual house was built, partially, on what should have been my property. This wasn't about a fence line or a garden anymore. This was a full-scale land overlap, and it had been there for years, unnoticed, accepted as normal. I remember pacing around my kitchen that night, holding the report, whispering to myself, how could this even happen? How can an HOA, an organization that fines people for leaving trash cans out too long, not notice something like this? That was the moment my disbelief turned into determination. I decided I was going to find out exactly how deep this mistake went, who caused it, who covered it, and how so many people could live comfortably on something that wasn't theirs. I didn't realize it yet, but that decision would consume the next several months of my life. Looking back, that first week feels like a fog, a blur of late nights, phone calls, and that sinking realization that the home I loved wasn't exactly what I thought it was. But what I didn't know then was that this error wasn't random. It was woven into the very foundation of the neighborhood, a flaw buried under years of signatures, approvals, and indifference. And the people responsible? They weren't strangers in an office downtown. They were sitting just across the street at the next HOA board meeting. That's where my real investigation began, into the paper trail that would expose how my land became theirs. When I realized that a portion of my backyard wasn't legally mine, my first instinct was to fix it, to find the paperwork, get it corrected, and move on. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't a quick fix. It was a maze, and at the center of it was the HOA. The first step was simple: get the full history of my property. I went down to the county recorder's office, that sterile building with fluorescent lights and walls lined with dusty binders. The clerk there handed me a stack of files that looked older than me. Every sale, every boundary adjustment, every developer note since the land was first divided 20 years ago. I started flipping through them one page at a time. At first, it was all normal: transfer deeds, signatures, a few amendments. But then something caught my eye. A plat map, dated 2006, the year the subdivision was finalized. On that map, the lot boundaries were slightly different from the modern one. My lot, Lot 47, extended further back than it does now. But there was a red pencil mark, faint but visible, circling the rear section with a note scrawled beside it: "Adjustment pending, HOA common use realignment." My stomach tightened. Adjustment pending? What adjustment? And what exactly did HOA common use mean? A few days later, I showed up at the HOA office, a small suite tucked behind a local cafe with beige walls and the faint smell of burnt coffee. The receptionist looked up and smiled the polite, professional smile of someone who was seeing too many complaints in 1 week. I introduced myself, handed over my survey, and asked to speak with the property manager. After a short wait, a woman named Carla appeared. She had that firm, rehearsed tone people use when they want to sound helpful but stay in control. I understand there is a boundary issue, she asked, taking the papers. I explained everything: the survey, the maps, the missing portion of land. She scanned the documents and nodded slowly. Then she said something that immediately raised a red flag. We've had a few of these situations before. It usually traces back to how the developer filed the original plats. Once the HOA took over, we inherited those layouts as is. I leaned forward. So the HOA knew about discrepancies in property lines? She hesitated for a second too long. I wouldn't say new exactly. More like we're aware some older maps aren't entirely consistent. That word consistent echoed in my head. It was the kind of word people use when they don't want to say wrong. When I asked for copies of the HOA's original development plans, Carla frowned. Those are in our archives. I'll have to check with the board before releasing them. That was my next clue. Whenever someone mentions checking with the board, you know something's up. So I waited. Days passed, then a week, then 2. No response. Finally, I showed up again, unannounced. This time, Carla wasn't there, but her assistant Brian was, a young guy, maybe mid-20s, who clearly wasn't used to confrontation. I explained the situation again. He nervously checked a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Phase 1 Developer Transfer. Inside were the HOA's original transition papers when the neighborhood was officially handed from the builder to the Residents Association. As I skimmed through, one page stood out. Land Allocation Addendum, Shared Open Use Zone. It described a community buffer zone created behind several lots, including mine. But that buffer zone was never shown on the final HOA maps given to homeowners, including me. That was the moment it clicked. The developer, while designing the neighborhood, had drawn a narrow strip of land, a buffer, meant to stay under HOA ownership for drainage purposes. But somewhere between construction and sales, those lines blurred. Some properties, like mine, were sold as if that buffer didn't exist. And when the HOA later inherited the land, they simply assumed the developer's version was accurate, even though it wasn't. It was a paper trail blunder, one that slipped through because everyone trusted the last set of documents without checking the originals. I remember staring at that addendum, the kind of form printed on thin, cheap paper that could crumble if you breathed too hard. A mistake, one line, one oversight had created a years-long lie that no one had noticed. Until now. That evening, I attended the next HOA meeting. It was held in the local community hall. Folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and a few dozen residents chatting about landscaping budgets. When the resident concerns portion came up, I stood. I introduced myself and calmly explained what I'd discovered: the overlapping boundaries, the missing documents, and the drainage zone that never appeared in the HOA maps. At first, the board looked confused, then defensive. Linda, the board president, adjusted her glasses and said, "That's the first I've heard of this. If it were true, our management company would have flagged it years ago." I handed her copies of the survey and the HOA transition papers. The room went quiet. She flipped through them slowly. Then she looked up and said, "We'll need to verify this with our legal team." Her tone was measured, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew this was bad. Over the next few weeks, I entered what I can only describe as the bureaucratic loop from hell. Emails to the HOA went unanswered for days. When I called, I was told the issue was being reviewed by council. When I contacted the county, they said it was a private HOA matter. When I reached out to the developer, who had long since moved on to new projects, they said all records had been transferred to the association. It was a perfect circle of responsibility, everyone pointing to someone else. And while they passed the blame, I was still the one living with the problem. A property I legally didn't fully own, with no one willing to fix it. During this time, a few neighbors started to notice my frequent visits to the HOA office. One evening, while I was checking my mail, my next-door neighbor Tracy walked over. She lowered her voice and said, "Hey, I heard you're looking into the land records. You might want to talk to Mike down the street. He had some weird issue with his lot years ago." That night, I met Mike. He invited me into his garage, where he kept a stack of old HOA newsletters and correspondence. Sure enough, buried in a newsletter from 2012 was a short notice. Residents along the east property line may notice boundary adjustments due to updated HOA mapping. It was vague, and no follow-up notice ever came after that. But it proved one thing. The HOA knew there were mapping errors over a decade ago. They just never corrected them. Fueled by frustration, I went back to the HOA archives one last time. This time, I wasn't leaving until I found something concrete. After 2 hours of searching through dusty binders, I found it. An email chain between the original developer's project manager and an HOA representative dated 2008. In that email, the developer wrote, "We're aware that a few property lines overlap with the HOA's drainage reserve area. The adjustments should be finalized before homeowner sales close." And the HOA rep responded, "Understood. As long as it's recorded before turnover, we're fine." But it was never recorded. That was it. That was the HOA blunder, the exact moment where a forgotten line on a map became a legal nightmare for future homeowners. When I left that office, I wasn't just frustrated, I was angry. Because this wasn't just an innocent mistake anymore. It was negligence, hidden behind years of paperwork and silence. All that talk about community standards and rules to protect property values, yet the very people enforcing those rules didn't even know where the property lines truly were. And while they fined people for mailbox paint colors or garden decorations, they had missed the one thing that actually mattered: the land itself. By the time I uncovered the truth, I wasn't just a homeowner dealing with a boundary issue. I was the accidental whistleblower of a years-old mistake, one that the HOA could no longer ignore. But the problem was bigger than I realized, because those trespassers the survey mentioned, they weren't faceless names on paper. They were my neighbors, families who had unknowingly built their homes on my land. And what came next would test every ounce of patience I had left. If you had told me a year ago that I would be caught in a property dispute with my own neighbors, I would have laughed it off. But when the line between mine and theirs disappears, literally, laughter is the first thing that dies. It started with a single line in the surveyor's report: residential foundations observed within disputed boundary zone. Those foundations belonged to two houses, one belonging to Tom and Rachel, and the other to Eric and Janet. Both families I waved to nearly every day. Their kids played soccer in the cul-de-sac. We exchanged holiday cards. And now I had to tell them that part of their homes, their actual homes, sat on my land. How do you even start that conversation? You cannot just walk up to someone and say, "Hey, your living room might technically be in my backyard," but I had to. I decided to start with Tom and Rachel. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind where the neighborhood hums with lawnmowers and distant laughter. I walked over, holding my survey documents like they were a peace offering. Tom was in the driveway, washing his car. I took a deep breath and said, "Tom, there's something weird I need to talk to you about. It's about the property lines." He looked up, smiling at first, until he saw the papers. Then his smile faded. I explained everything: the survey, the HOA blunder, the drainage zone no one recorded. At first, he was silent. Then he said, "Wait, are you saying my house is on your property?" I nodded, feeling my chest tighten. "Not all of it, just a corner, maybe 10 feet into your side yard." He ran his hand through his hair, staring at the ground. "I don't even know what to say," he muttered. "We bought this house fair and square. How could this happen?" I told him I didn't blame him, that it was a mistake from the beginning, buried in paperwork. But that didn't make it any easier to hear. Rachel came outside halfway through the conversation. When she realized what we were talking about, her eyes widened. She looked at me, then at their home, the place they built memories, raised kids, hosted birthdays. Her voice cracked when she said, "So what happens now? Do we have to move?" That question hung in the air like smoke. I had no answer. That night I barely slept. The guilt hit me in waves. I had every right to fight for my property, but I also knew that behind every disputed boundary was a real family, caught in the same mess I was. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't mine. But the system didn't care about fairness. It only cared about what was on paper. And that's what hurt the most. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I could have said it differently. But there's no soft way to tell someone their home might not be entirely theirs. Weeks went by, and the situation started to take a toll. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., mind racing with what-ifs. What if I lost part of my yard permanently? What if they turned against me? What if the HOA tried to blame me for raising it at all? The stress seeped into everything: my work, my sleep, my conversations. Friends noticed I was quieter, distracted. I'd start talking about survey markers and easement rights like it was small talk, forgetting not everyone lived in legal chaos. One night I found myself standing in the backyard, flashlight in hand, tracing the invisible property line that had started it all. I just stood there, staring into the dark, wondering how something so small, a few feet of land, could cause so much turmoil. Then came Eric and Janet, the couple whose property overlapped the most. They were kind people, always the first to help out during HOA cleanup days, the kind who waved when you drove by. So when I approached them, I expected empathy. Instead, I got defensiveness. When I explained the situation, Eric immediately said, "That can't be right. Our builder marked that boundary himself." I showed him the survey. He crossed his arms, jaw tight. "Then your surveyor's wrong." Janet tried to calm him, but I could tell they both felt cornered. To them, admitting my claim was true meant accepting a nightmare, that their dream home sat on someone else's property. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Eric saying, "We'll have our lawyer look into it." That was the first time the word lawyer entered the picture, and it hit me hard. It did not take long for word to spread. Within a week, whispers started floating around the neighborhood Facebook group. Posts appeared with vague titles like, "Anyone else getting weird survey notices?" Some neighbors reached out privately to express support. Others started avoiding me altogether. At the next HOA meeting, I could feel eyes on me, the subtle kind of judgment people cast when they think you're causing trouble. One board member even joked, "Guess we'll need a lawyer at every barbecue now." It got a few nervous laughs, but it stung. I wasn't trying to start a war. I was trying to fix something broken. But to them, I was the one shaking the foundation of the neighborhood, literally and metaphorically. Meanwhile, everything dragged on. Emails, legal reviews, more surveys. Each new document only seemed to raise more questions. The HOA's attorney finally sent a formal notice acknowledging the discrepancy, but stated they were working to resolve it through proper channels. That phrase, proper channels, became my least favorite set of words. It meant nothing and everything at once. It meant wait. It meant don't push. It meant we're covering ourselves legally. And all I could do was wait.
Weeks turned into months. Every day that passed, I watched my relationships with neighbors grow more strained. Small waves, polite nods, fewer conversations. The warmth that once filled the cul-de-sac was gone, replaced with silent suspicion. I used to believe bureaucracy was just boring paperwork, harmless red tape that slowed things down. But now I understood what it really costs. It costs peace. It costs trust. It costs sleep, sanity, and sometimes friendships. The system that was supposed to protect homeowners was tearing us apart. And the saddest part? It all started with one misplaced line on a map, a single human error that grew roots, spread, and became a wall between neighbors. It all came to a head one afternoon, when I received a letter, an official-looking envelope stamped with my HOA's logo. Inside was a notice titled Pending Property Review, Lot Line Dispute. But at the bottom, in smaller text, it said, "Please refrain from further discussion of this issue with other residents until the board has concluded its investigation."
In other words, stay quiet. That was the moment I realized the HOA didn't just want to fix the problem, they wanted to control it, to manage the narrative, to make sure no one looked too closely at their mistake. And that made my choice clear. I was done waiting, done being polite, done letting bureaucracy hide behind fine print. It was time to fight, not just for my land, but for the truth. What began as a boundary issue had become something much bigger, a test of patience, of integrity, and of how far an ordinary homeowner could be pushed before breaking. But if the HOA wanted silence, they picked the wrong person, because I was done being quiet. The next step wasn't a conversation or an email. It was a legal one. The decision to fight did not come easily. I had spent sleepless nights staring at the survey maps, flipping through property deeds and rereading every email from the HOA, trying to make sense of how something so absurd could happen. But at some point, confusion turned into conviction. I knew this was not just about land anymore. It was about principle. Finding a lawyer who understood the labyrinth of HOA law was another battle in itself. Most attorneys I called either specialized in standard real estate transactions or criminal defense. They would politely decline, saying, "That's a messy area. You're fighting an association, not a person." Finally, a friend referred me to a property attorney named Carla Jensen, someone who had taken on HOA boards before and won. When I sat in her office, she barely said a word for the first 15 minutes. She just listened, flipping through my stack of documents, occasionally scribbling notes. Then she looked up and said something that gave me both hope and dread. "You've got a case, but it's going to be ugly." That was all I needed to hear. Carla's first step was to request the HOA's full development records, original plats, amendments, and any easement changes. What came back was chaos. Half of the files were scanned copies from the 1990s, with faded ink and handwritten notes in the margins. We discovered that the original developer had made a mapping error, a simple but devastating survey misalignment that went unnoticed for over a decade. When the HOA later updated its records, they used the wrong base map. That single oversight caused the property lines of multiple homes to shift by several feet, right into my land. To make things worse, the HOA continued to issue approvals and collect fees based on those incorrect maps. In Carla's words, "It's a bureaucratic domino effect. One bad map, and now half the neighborhood is technically trespassing." I remember sitting there, stunned. This was not just a blunder, it was institutional negligence. Before filing any lawsuit, Carla suggested we give the HOA a chance to settle. She drafted a professional, detailed letter listing every discrepancy, every boundary violation, every document that contradicted their claims. We sent it to the HOA board with a simple request: Let's resolve this amicably before we go to court. Their response? A cold, one-paragraph email that read, "The board has reviewed your claims and found no actionable wrongdoing. We consider the matter closed." That sentence lit a fire in me. They did not even bother to address the evidence. It was as if they were daring me to take the next step. So, I did. Carla filed the preliminary motion, a property boundary dispute against the HOA and the developer's successor company. It was official now. I was no longer just a frustrated homeowner. I was a plaintiff in a lawsuit. Once word got out, the neighborhood changed overnight. Some neighbors quietly supported me, sending messages like, "We're with you. They've bullied too many people."
Others avoided eye contact, afraid to take sides. And a few were openly hostile, muttering things like, "You're making this harder for everyone." Walking my dog felt different. The once friendly waves from neighbors had turned into tight-lipped nods. The sense of community I had loved so much was gone, replaced by invisible walls of tension. The HOA president even called an emergency board meeting, conveniently without inviting me. A neighbor later told me it was basically an hour of the board trying to figure out how to discredit my claims. But Carla had warned me, they'll try to make you look unreasonable. That's standard playbook. Stay calm, stay factual, and let the evidence speak. So that's what I did. Lawsuits are not dramatic like TV shows. They are long, slow, and painfully silent. Weeks turned into months. Depositions were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled again. Each new filing came with its own mountain of paperwork and legal jargon. There were nights when I doubted myself, when I wondered if it was worth all this emotional and financial strain. My savings were shrinking, my stress was rising, and there was still no guarantee I would win. But every time I walked to the edge of my yard, where the invisible line between my land and their homes existed, I reminded myself, this is mine. And if I gave up now, I'd be letting them erase not just my boundary, but my right to stand up for what is fair. Then, out of nowhere, we got a break. Carla found an old survey file buried in the county archives that clearly showed the original lot lines before the HOA's update. The evidence was irrefutable. The map error had been introduced after the HOA took control from the developer. That meant the association itself bore responsibility. When we submitted that document, the tone shifted. Suddenly, the HOA's lawyer requested mediation. They wanted to talk, privately, off record. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of victory. Not a full win yet, but a sign that they knew the truth was catching up. The mediation session was tense, but professional. I cannot share details because of legal confidentiality, but let's just say the conversation was very different this time. There were no dismissive tones, no denials, just cautious offers and careful words. Walking out of that room, Carla turned to me and said, "They know they messed up. Now it's about what they're willing to fix." That line stuck with me, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the system was working for me instead of against me. But even as the legal dust began to settle, something deeper remained unresolved: the emotional cost of this entire ordeal. The land fight had taken a year of my life, strained relationships, and drained savings. Yet, it also taught me something powerful about courage in conviction. Because sometimes doing what is right means standing alone, even when everyone around you says to back down. And that realization leads us into the final part of this story: the lessons I learned and how others can avoid ever facing the same battle. The fight over my land took more than maps and meetings. It took time, peace of mind, and a piece of who I was before it all began. But it also gave me clarity, a raw, honest understanding of how fragile ownership can be when bureaucracy and blind trust intersect. This final chapter is not about revenge or bitterness. It is about reflection, lessons learned the hard way, and a message for anyone who owns or dreams of owning a home in an HOA community. When you buy a home, you think of it as your sanctuary. You picture safety, belonging, control.
But the truth? You don't own your home. Not in the way you think. You share it in pieces with developers, associations, and systems built to manage what they call community harmony. I learned that the hard way. One small mapping error, one line drawn a few feet off, and suddenly my owned land was up for debate. That realization forced me to see property not as something you possess, but something you must constantly protect.
It is not paranoia. It is responsibility. If I could go back to the day I signed those purchase papers, I would tell myself 3 things, and I hope these can help you too. 1, always get your own survey. Do not rely solely on the one attached to your closing documents. Have an independent survey done, fresh, accurate, verified. It might feel redundant, but it can save you from a lifetime of trouble. 2, read every HOA document, especially the fine print. I know they are dense and boring, but buried inside those clauses are the limits of your power and the reach of theirs. Learn them, highlight them, question them. Do not assume the HOA knows what it is doing. They are people, often volunteers, not professionals. They can make mistakes, and sometimes they hide behind policies to avoid admitting them. Stay polite, but persistent, because silence is exactly what lets small errors grow into disasters. The legal process is still ongoing, slow, quiet, and uncertain. Mediation gave me leverage, but not closure. There are still negotiations happening behind closed doors, and no one knows how this story truly ends. Maybe the boundaries will be corrected, restoring what is mine. Maybe I will be compensated for the encroachment. Or maybe, like so many others before me, I will settle for peace over perfection. Whatever the outcome, one thing is clear. I will never look at land the same way again. That stretch of dirt behind my fence used to be just a part of my backyard. Now, it is a symbol of how fragile fairness can be and how strong you have to become to protect it. The neighborhood is not the same. Some neighbors still keep their distance, unsure which side they stand on. Others quietly thank me for exposing the flaws they never dared to question. But over time, even the tension began to fade. There's a strange kind of healing that happens after truth surfaces. I started small, a wave here, a kind word there, and slowly the silence broke. One of the homeowners, whose patio sits partly on my land, even came by one evening. He said, "I'm sorry for how this turned out. I didn't know." That moment, more than any document or dollar, felt like closure. This story began with a property line, but it became something far larger. It's about how ordinary people get lost in systems designed to serve them. It's about how rules can protect power instead of fairness. And it's about the quiet strength it takes to stand up and say, "No, this is wrong," even when everyone else tells you to let it go. If there is one message I want to leave behind, it is this. Do not assume the system is right just because it's written down. Paper can lie. Maps can mislead. Titles can misprint. But your courage, your persistence, that is the one thing that cannot be taken. Standing there one last time, at the edge of my yard, I looked across the boundary that started it all. Grass, fence, silence. No legal jargon, no documents, just land. The same land that started as a quiet backyard and turned into a battleground for truth. And in that stillness, I realized something simple. Sometimes justice isn't about winning. It's about not surrendering. That right there is the real victory. You know, when I first found out part of my land was not legally mine, I thought it would be a quick fix, a simple misunderstanding. But it became something much bigger. A reminder that even in our own neighborhoods, truth can get buried under paperwork, politics, and pride. If you take anything away from this story, let it be this: never stop asking questions. Never assume everything is as it seems. Whether it's your land, your rights, or your peace of mind, protect them. Because once they're gone, getting them back takes more than effort. It takes courage. To everyone who has ever stood up against unfair rules or broken systems, you are not alone. Your story matters. This was My Land, Their Homes, Unraveling the HOA Blunder. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the fight for fairness is far from over, and there are more stories to tell.